Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today, our guest is Jannik Hartmann. He is a project assistant at dgap, a German Council on Foreign Relations, a Berlin-based think tank, which deals with the topics of defense, security, foreign policy, and others. And he has published recently a paper on what are the interests of Russia on underwater cables and pipelines and everything. And we will talk today about all this stuff with him. Welcome, Jannik.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Please, recently there was a leak on a gas pipeline connecting Finland and Estonia, and both countries said that they have strong suspicions that Russia is staying behind it. What is going on the Baltic Sea and the Gulf of Finland with the undersea cables and pipelines?
Yeah, I mean, the news that came out last week was very worrying for all of us and kind of reminiscent on the attacks that we have seen almost exactly 1 year ago on the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. So basically, a pipeline connecting Finland to Estonia, 150 kilometers in length, was damaged. It is very unlikely that this damage comes from an accident. There is a drop in pressure that has been witnessed and monitored, and this is likely to come from a hole within the pipeline itself. And it's not just the pipeline. There have also been mentions of another undersea cable, a telecommunication cable, being damaged between Estonia and Finland, as well as a news that came out just yesterday of also yet another telecommunication cable between Sweden and Estonia. And this points to a very recent trend and a rising of these incidents that we are seeing right now.
Well, besides this, sounds all very scary and terrifying and troubling. But besides the fact that the cables are being damaged of the countries which Russia sees as rivals or threat or enemies, what points out to the idea that the Russians are staying behind it?
Yeah, so basically NATO has been warning for a long time, since 2017 already, of increased Russian naval activity in the Baltic Sea. So there have been numerous reports of, for instance, research vessels that are disguised as basically Russian operated ships that are mapping these exact positions of the cables and the pipelines. There were also unconfirmed reports that such a research vessel was picked up or to affected to be part of the most recent incident last week. So yeah, this is a very worrisome trend, and there have been numerous incidents like these. For instance, also just last year in 2022, a French ship escorted a Russian submarine that was detected in the Baltic Sea and into the economic contingency zones out of this area, just for security measures.
Like, when we are talking about all these incidents, what is the infrastructure which is of interest of Russia? You have already mentioned pipelines, energy infrastructure, but also telecommunication lines. What is what can we assume is Russia's strategic interest?
Yes, so I mean, the infrastructure behind that is quite complex. In principle, you have just the pipelines that obviously are very important for the energy security in times of scarce Russian gas in Europe. And you have the telecommunication cables. So they are basically somewhere deep into the ocean. Some of the telecommunication cables are buried. Some are just on the floor. And they are difficult to detect in the first place, right? The cables are small. They shift between the currents. So it's difficult to find them, and they're also not plotted on maps. So this is why Russia has a very severe interest in finding out where these exact cable positions are. In more shallow waters, these cables are actually mapped on navigational charts to prevent accidents, so we know where they are. As for the pipelines, they are much more easily detectable than the cables itself. They're thicker, they respond to signals, so they can be found easily. But this is just one part of the infrastructure, right? So as soon as, for instance, the cable goes to shore, they enter a so-called cable landing station where they get dispersed to the country, to the other country's infrastructure. And some of these cable landing stations, they are basically connecting to various submarine cables. So basically, there are some cable landing stations where 10 or 15 cables enter at the same time. So these are also very vulnerable points, not just the cable itself, but imagine an attack on one of these landing stations and you have not just one cable damage, but 15.
But when we talk about like cables, as far as I understand, there is not only the fear that the Russians can cut it or destroy it, which can like be can have like devastating consequences, especially if the cable is pretty deep and it's hard to repair. But also they can tap it. Like you cannot tap a pipeline, but you can tape a cable, and then you can like practically get the data which are being communicated, or you can like you can influence somehow. Can one protect these cables? Can we be sure that nothing of that kind has happened to them yet?
Well, we cannot be certain. And a huge problem is that these cables are part of a very intricate and complicated set of stakeholders. We have the owners that are mostly telecommunication companies, but we have also a large private sector involvement when it comes to the maintenance, involvement when it comes to the repair of them, and involvement when it comes to creating these links in the first place. And this is not just Russia who has an interest in that. It's also China. For instance, a company called HMN Technologies, formerly Huawei Maritime Technologies, actually owns like a 10% share when it comes to worldwide internet cable connectivity. And they have not only maintained, but also created 100 of the 400 cables in total worldwide. So yes, there is indeed the possibility to plug in backdoors to tap information that is out there, and this has to be regulated in the first place. There has to be attention to drawn on that issue.
But just to understand it, these underwater cable, transatlantic and the other ones, as far as I understand, there is not that much of them. There are like several massive like highways, informational highways, and as far as I understand, the most of world communication goes not via satellites but via these cables. Am I wrong?
No, you are absolutely right. So when it comes to satellite connectivity, satellites only account for a very, very small portion, just a few % of transferring data. And satellites are not only super expensive to operate, and they are also just more suitable for more remote locations, for instance, in Africa, where most of Elon Musk's Starlink is used. So we have actually submarine cables that are required for transferring data of roughly 95% when it comes to worldwide internet traffic. And this is massive, right? So we have links that are very strong when it comes to connectivity, for instance, between the EU and North America. We have a strong link between the EU and Africa. But we have more weak links when it comes to EU connectivity itself. For instance, small island states such as Malta, such as Finland, are connected with just a few cables, and there's an increasingly probability that when you cut these cables, yes, traffic can be rerouted, but when you cut too many of these cables or destroy too many of these landing stations, you would have increasing problems to maintain the data trafficking speeds that you desire.
So theoretically, one can just cut Finland, a NATO member, out of the communication with the world or with most of European countries. But what does the international law, and especially maritime law, say about that? Is like these cables are property of someone, but it's not a sovereign territory. if one state attacks this property and one can prove it, what are the consequences?
Yeah, maybe just to be clear on the previous aspect. So it's very difficult to cut off one country off the entire communication, right? There is also land-based infrastructure, and there's partly satellite infrastructure, but you would have to cut various cables. And also to find these cables in the first place is not the easiest undertaking, and this would get noticed pretty rapidly. So, for instance, for a country like Malta or Cyprus to be cut off, it is theoretically possible, and it is a possibility that should be taken very serious. But it's not likely that this would happen from 1 hour to another. When it comes to your second question, I mean, we see that NATO and other countries that are whose infrastructure has been damaged take this very seriously. So we have investigations now that are being launched jointly as well as individually. Estonia said it launched an investigation. Sweden just said yesterday it launched investigations, and not to forget about the incidents last year with the Nord Stream pipelines. We have also joint investigations, because when a damage occurs in exclusive economic zones that are part of multiple countries, all countries have the right to undertake investigations. And this is what we are seeing, but we also see that these countries are very quiet about what they find out in these investigations. So nothing concrete has been coming out so far of these.
But that is exactly my question. Like, can we first, let us have a look at what happened with MH17. MH17 was shut down in 2014, and only, if I'm not mistaken, in 2021 or 22, the court has figured out that yes, that were the Russian troops which were responsible for this disaster, for this murder of over 200 innocent people. Despite the fact that we had this on land, we had it in an area which was densely populated. We had a lot of photos, of videos of how this anti-air missiles set book was transported there. We have witnesses. We have all the evidences on the ground. We have the whole body of the plane being collected and analyzed. So we had all this. When it happens under the sea, we don't have all these witness photos. We don't have anything. We have only, maybe we can send a submarine and make photos of, or take samples of this blown up place. But okay, can we find some traces of explosive stuff and nothing more? How can we prove it to the extent that we can bring the country which is responsible for that to some consequences?
Yeah, you point to a very, very difficult problem. Obviously, the sea is massive, and especially when it comes to underwater activity, it is very difficult to monitor. So obviously, you have submarines that are patrolling the Baltic Sea, and this has been increasing within the with the attacks of the last 2 years. But also you can use satellite images to perhaps reconstruct some of what has been going on. It's not just submarines in the first place that damage these cables or that damage the pipelines. They are usually there to detect them. But what is possible is that you, for instance, charter a ship, and on that ship there are various actors that have submersive vehicles with them, dive deep, attach explosives to cables or to pipelines, and then blow it up. And then you can use satellite information or charter information of these boats to reconstruct perhaps some of what has been happening. But this is obviously, and you rightfully say that, a very difficult undertaking.
But this brings us further to the question. It is if it is, let me say, if it is Russia which consequently and repeatedly attack our underwater infrastructure, what I personally believe it is, then it can be seen as an act of aggression. It is deliberate destruction of our strategic infrastructure. with a clear intent to weaken our defense capacities and our security, particularly in energy or in communication. And this can be seen as an act of aggression, and the act of aggression requires an answer. But as long as we have no solid proofs towards our parliaments or our audiences, our publicity, our nations, we cannot undertake any hard steps. And doesn't it provide Russia with incredible leverage against us? They can continue to attack our infrastructure, and we practically have nothing we can do against them. Just only if I don't know, our intelligence services will try to undertake the similar actions against the Russian infrastructure, which I personally doubt they will do.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, rhetoric is very crucial here, but also what's even more crucial than that is actually concrete action, and action in this case means deterrence. So what should be done is, first of all, when it comes to actual recommendations, that the EU, for instance, could create a joint mission in cooperation with NATO that increases surveillance within these regions, that does concrete stress tests, that increases patrolling, and also, and even more importantly, that such a mission creates a mandate for a specific entity. Because right now, as I've said before, we have this very intricate and complex set of actors, and no body within the European Union is concretely responsible for that. So, for instance, what could happen is that we say the European's Maritime Agency, EMSA, could be tasked with a specific mandate on patrolling and increasing the resilience of this infrastructure. And this would also mean that it gets the capabilities to do so, because right now it does not have them. For instance, Frontex, which is largely tasked with migration, does have access to satellite capacity, does have access to other tools that increase its surveillance capacity. But what is crucial is that we find one entity, identify it, and then give it the possibilities to actually make deterrence successful. And other actors will take us seriously and thus refrain from such violent action.
Well, that is, of course, a huge task. And we know that the EU is famous for being slow in actions. We can imagine that creation of such an agency can take at least a couple of years. Can NATO overtake these tasks until a EU agency will be founded for that? These all undersea cables you have mentioned, which are especially vulnerable for internal EU communication, they're mostly connecting the NATO members, or at least one NATO member to a non-NATO member, and they are all most in practically internal NATO waters, like the Baltic Sea, Northern Sea, or parts of Mediterranean.
Yes, NATO certainly has capabilities that it can use. And the most recent example of that is that NATO actually launched a new center in Northwood that is completely dedicated to submarine securing capabilities. And I mean, when it comes to other EU actors, the problem is more that the level of awareness is not very evenly distributed. You have actors, countries in the EU that have crucial links, for instance, Ireland, or for instance, Denmark. Yet the level of awareness is very difficult. For instance, Ireland adapted submarine cable infrastructure to their maritime documents and is increasing patrolling and has quite high level of awareness. Whereas Denmark, for instance, with crucial infrastructure in the maritime way, is not doing anything. And this is quite troublesome, right? So this issue has to be brought to attention to all crucial EU member states that have such infrastructure at the same time. They should get it into their respective security documents. They should increase patrolling. They should do stress tests. So it's not just on the EU, it's not just on NATO. One state alone that has such infrastructure can do quite a lot.
So what is the perspective for the next months? Can we assume that the EU will really undertake concrete steps and deter Russia, or will we face a situation when we send our deepest concerns towards Russia, but the Russians continue to attack our infrastructure?
Certainly, certainly what such incidents do in the first place is create momentum. There was a lot of momentum and level of awareness created when Russia invaded Ukraine in the first place on such infrastructure. There was momentum created when the pipelines of Nord Stream were blown up. And just now, last week, there was another moment of momentum, which is very helpful in pushing these to state level attention. I think still there is a lot the EU can do. It is not just dedicating one of its agencies to one such specific problem, but it is also actually increasing repair capabilities. For instance, there are just 3 repair ships within the EU that are able to repair such cables. And for instance, one such repair takes about 2 weeks. Now think about that 3 or 4 cables are damaged at the same time and you already run into a problem. 2 of these ships are stationed in the Mediterranean. One is on the north coast of France. And well, accidentally, there is no concrete such ship in the Baltic stationed. So you have now cables that are being damaged in the Baltic and the ship has to go there. And this is capacity that has crucially to be increased. And it's not just the ships, it's also raw material. And most of these operations, or actually all of them, take place by the private sector. So another recommendation that I can just express would be centralizing these repair capabilities and put more resources, allocate more resources at increasing them.
Well, that is the roadmap practically to increase our security and our resilience towards the potential attacks, not only from Russia, but also from other hostile actors who could target our infrastructure and try to undermine our stability and create some sort of chaos economically, politically in the EU. Thank you so much. It was Jannik Hartmann, who is a project assistant at dgap, German Council on Foreign Relations, a Berlin-based think tank. Thank you, Jannik. Don't forget to subscribe, to like, to share this channel, write your comments under this video. And thank you once again.
Thank you too.